Hey, this is just a quick summary to go over what we read in class with chapter one and some of the things that we talked about with chapter one. So, in chapter one, we are first introduced to the setting, and Steinbeck describes the setting as very peaceful and idyllic and almost like a paradise. So, he has this area that is right off a river. It's called the Salinas River, and they are near a city named Soledad. Now, the name of this city, Soledad, is important because if you speak Spanish, then the word soledad actually means loneliness. And as we talked about yesterday, loneliness is one of the themes that's going to be prevalent in this novel. So the fact that they're even living in this city of loneliness is going to be really important. Now, the story also it takes place in California, and many people came to California to work as migrant workers because California had all of these farms, and they actually had more farms than they had people who could like actually work there. So people would come in who were immigrants. Black people would also work there, and then white people who had traveled from other cities to be there and have these jobs as migrant workers. Now, a lot of these people move around a whole lot. They don't have any permanent residence. They maybe don't even have a whole lot of permanent possessions. Like what their possessions are, just the things that they absolutely need that are essential for their survival. This does take place during the Great Depression, and right after the Dust Bowl. So America itself was in a really bad place, and a lot of people were really struggling to find work. Now, we are introduced then to our two main characters. Those are George and Lenny. George and Lenny are good friends, and George is kind of Lenny's caretaker. Lenny has some sort of disability. It's never really described what he has, but we do know that it makes him very, very forgetful. He can't remember things from moment to moment. He also has a really hard time remembering things from his past. And he also has some impulse control that he struggles with. One of those impulses being his desire to touch soft things. Now, George and Lenny kind of get in a little bit of a fight because Lenny is like messing around in his pocket, and George says, "What do you have in your pocket?" Lenny lies and said nothing, and it turns out that he actually has a dead mouse in his pocket, and he's just like stroking this dead mouse. He just loves the feel of the soft fur, even though it's really gross that he has this dead animal in his pocket. So George ends up making him he throws the mouse away, and Lenny's really upset because Lenny just wants to pet his soft things. Now, his desire to touch soft things has apparently been a problem for him in the past. We later learn in the chapter that George and Lenny are they were run out of town in the last city that they were in, the city of Weed. And that was because Lenny saw a woman and he liked the fabric of her dress, and the dress looked really soft. And so he went up to her and he just grabbed her dress. And so can you imagine there's this huge guy grabbing this strange woman's dress. She obviously freaks out and screams, and when he doesn't know what to do, he's freaked out that she's yelling, and he grabs on even tighter. Now this gets them into some hot water because the men in the city of Weed, they come to protect this woman for she's been touched inappropriately, and so they end up chasing George and Lenny out of town. George and Lenny have to hide in a ditch in order to escape these men who would have quite possibly killed them. And they are able then to make it to this city near Soledad, Loneliness, where they are going to then be working on a ranch. So some adjectives that we use to describe George: he is very authoritative. He is the one who is making the decisions. He understands social cues. He's smaller in stature than Lenny, and he is also the one that's in charge. Lenny, his kind of counterpart, is much, much larger. He's described as being a humongous person. He's slow mentally. He's very forgetful. He's a very big guy. He's often described as being really animalistic. I think within chapter one, there are 5 times where Lenny is referred to with some sort of an animal-like description. The first 2 being that he walked along dragging his hands like a bear drags its paws, and that he was snorting into the water and drinking like a horse. So we do have that really clear example that Lenny is more animalistic, where George is kind of like his caretaker, and Lenny's also very childish. And when we say childish, I mean more so that he's innocent. I don't think that Lenny has a mean bone in his body. He doesn't want to harm anyone or harm anything, but he doesn't really know his own strength, and he's a huge guy. At the end of this chapter, the guys share some beans and fall asleep by the river and kind of just enjoy this peaceful setting. However, there is this dark, ominous, foreboding tone because we do know that in every city that these two guys have worked, Lenny has caused some sort of trouble where the guys have had to flee. And George tells Lenny to remember this location next to the river, and if he gets in trouble on their next job, to run there and hide in the bushes. And so we do have that really clear foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen. And so even though this is in kind of like a calm, peaceful, idyllic setting, the fact is that there is this deep sense of foreshadowing that something terrible is going to happen in these upcoming chapters. So that's chapter 1. Let's talk briefly about chapter 2. Chapter 2, the guys actually make it to the ranch where they'll be working. They enter the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse is described in these first couple of pages as being really impersonal. This is a place where all of the white men who live or who work on the ranch sleep. And I hesitated to say they live there because many of these people are transient. They don't stay there long. They quit their jobs for whatever reason. One guy says he quits his job because he doesn't like the food. But they kind of come and go. The guys here don't really seem to have a long-term plan. There's also a lot of clear distinctions between the men who already work there and Lenny and George. One of those things being that Lenny and George have one another. Everybody else on the ranch is really lonely and doesn't really have that kind of a connection with anybody else. So chapter 2 takes place in the bunkhouse, and we get a lot of descriptions about the bunkhouse being kind of dirty. George is really freaked out because he sees a bottle of, let me find out where I am. He finds a bottle of some box that says it positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. And George is afraid that he's going to end up getting lice or like bed bugs or something from the bed that he's been assigned. And each man is only assigned an apple box to keep their possessions in. So it's kind of like not a very big box, and that's the only place they have for their personal possessions. And there's not really a whole lot of personal possessions. Speaking on that theme of loneliness, the guys here are playing solitaire. So rather than playing cards with each other and really like building a connection, pay attention to the fact that they're playing solitaire in this chapter. It's just another example of how each character in here is really alone, except for Lenny and George, who have one another. In chapter 2, we're going to be introduced to a couple of different characters. First guy that we're going to meet is a guy named Candy. Candy is an old white guy, and he has a smelly old white dog. Now, Candy used to be like really fit and really active and really like good at his job. And his dog, which is also really old and really smelly, also used to be a really good sheep herding dog. Now, both of them are kind of old and broken and don't have a whole lot of a function on the ranch as they are. So Candy just kind of, he only has one hand. We learn in this chapter that there was an accident, and he's like, oh yeah, well, they weren't being safe here and I lost my hand, but they gave me $50. And so the fact that there's just no value of life. And so Candy, he's not really valued. He just kind of cleans. They also call him the swamper, and that's because that's what they would call somebody who's a cleaner at the time. Now, Candy kind of gives them the lowdown on everything that happens at the ranch. They talk about Crooks. Crooks is the only black guy who lives on the ranch, and they will use the N-word to describe him. He works in the stable, and pay attention to the way that they describe him and what they do on Christmas. Normally we think of that as a time of like togetherness and family and celebration, but pay attention to how these guys celebrated Christmas. We are then also introduced to Curly. Curly, quite frankly, sucks. He's got little man syndrome, and by that I mean he's a short, tiny guy, and he tries to pick a fight with everyone who's bigger than him. And guess who's bigger than him? Lenny. Lenny's bigger than basically everyone. So he hates Lenny from the moment that he sees him for no other reason than he looks big and he looks strong, which he is. There's going to be a lot of foreshadowing in this chapter as well, because George tells Lenny to stay away from Curly, and he's telling Candy, I hope he doesn't try and pick a fight with Lenny. And hey, Lenny, I know you don't know your own strength. Try and stay away from him. He's the son of the boss. He fights with everyone. He sucks. We also kind of hear a little bit about Curly's wife. Now, it's really interesting. In this chapter, or in this entire book, we never learn her name. She is only ever called Curly's wife. This is a great example of how women didn't really have their own identities at this time, and that she is not at all respected. They call her a hussy. They call her a tart. They say that she's kind of trampy, but what she is she's just like everybody else on the ranch. She's freaking lonely. But anyway, pay attention to her. We then very briefly get introduced to Slim, and he's kind of like the prince of the ranch. We'll hear more about him in other chapters, but just know that he's kind of like the peacekeeper. I think that's really it before you start reading chapter 2. I'm going to make another video for you to watch after you've read chapter 2 that will kind of go into what's happened with chapter 2 and what things that you should pay attention to. There's also an analysis video that I'm going to post, and that's about 18 minutes long. You don't have to watch it if you don't want to, but it really goes into depth about every single character and what important quotes and why every character matters. So it's in your best interest to watch that, even though I'm not going to require it. So that should be that.